Chapter 2 Memory. Kaitee pulled another bush, worried about Derby. She'd made him promise to stay close to home before she'd left that morning. She always did. He was all she had left in the world. If any harm should come to him, she might as well just walk off the waterfall herself. She left for her labors each day with Meredy, and came home at sunset, entrusting him to the care of the village grandmothers and grandfathers who were too old and weak to work. Meredy would soon be one of them, especially if she took any more beatings. The children and aged stayed near the village well, working. Some mended clothes, some prepared food, some repaired tools, but they never strayed far from the guards and the shelter of the solid wooden huts. Derby worked alone, sitting by himself, nearby but separate from the main group. Most people thought he was crazy, so they left him alone. Sometimes he took a few lashes from the guards. He kept quiet, though, and they seemed to like that. Derby was 10, 5 years younger than Kaitee. When he was old enough, he'd be sent to work with the rest of them as she had. At least he'd be near her every day then. But that was a bad thing, too. The endless months of labor would eventually crush the last of the beautiful spirit right out of him. That seemed horribly sad. The loss of their parents had taken its toll on him, but he was still essentially Derby. His smile still lit her world now and then. What would happen to him, though, when his entire world turned into just ripping up the forest every day? She nearly wept thinking about it. Kaitee took care of him as best as she could, but she only saw him for a short while before bedtime, and most of that time was spent helping Meredy cook and clean and sew. She missed him every day. She worried about him constantly, and she kept an eye on the skies with a knot of worry in her stomach, dreading the sound of the village's warning bell. He was still small enough to be taken by the shadow, and when he wasn't, he'd be taken by the labors. A single bell chimed now, signaling the evening's food break, making her jump a little. There was a faint cheer from the children back at the village, and a heavy sigh from the working adults and elders. They kept working as they were required to, while the children scrambled to fetch the food sacks their families had prepared that morning. Minutes later the children were sprinting down the winding stony trails, through the maze of mucky puddles between the village and the distant line of foliage. The workers kept digging until each child got to where they were toiling. Then there were brief moments of happy hugs and kisses, while families sat down for a meal together. Derby arrived carrying a small bag of bread and roasted fish. He handed it to the guard. The guard took the largest portion for himself, tossed the bag at Meredy, wandering away to chat with another nearby guard. Meredy took a few bites for herself and gave Kaitee and the boy the remainder. Meredy mumbled thanks as they sat down to eat. "How's your day going, brother?" Kaitee asked him happily. "Having enough fun?" Derby frowned at her sarcasm, chewing vigorously on the half-hunk of bread. "Let me guess. Everybody's working by the river on such a hot day, but you're off by yourself." He nodded again. Kaitee sighed. "You really ought to make at least one friend, you know," she told him. "I worry about you being alone every day." Derby said nothing. He dropped his gaze to the ground and took another bite. "Will you help me prepare tomorrow's food later?" He nodded. He always helped. She didn't even have to ask, but it was something to talk about. Kaitee and Derby knew the break was nearly over, and they began playing the game where they kept giving each other the very last bite of bread, passing it back and forth to the person who would need it more. Kaitee used to insist he needed it more because he was a growing boy, while he would point at the bushes and wordlessly insist that she needed it more because of the hard labor. Whoever was holding it when the guard finally barked at them that the break was over got to eat it. Kaitee won today. "Back to work," the guard said, and Derby tossed a morsel of bread into her lap. She picked it up and popped it into her mouth. "I'll get you tomorrow," she whispered. Derby hugged her, holding her close, pressing his cheek into her chest. Finally the guard jammed his spear between the two of them, prying the boy off. "Away with you, rodent!" Derby grinned at Kaitee, turned and ran off toward the village. Children in all directions did the same. A lump formed in Kaitee's throat. It had been such a nice hug, and she felt bitter towards the guard, towards life in general for the 100th time that day. But later, when she reached into her satchel to grab her handkerchief, she found a whole other chunk of food her little rascal brother had slipped in there without her even noticing. "That little sneak," she whispered to herself. "I'll get him good." But her heart filled with a moment of joy at his generosity.
"I know of healing berries that will fix what's wrong with your brother's voice," Meredy said, when they'd returned to work.
"He chooses not to talk. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with him." Kaitee hadn't heard Derby utter a word since they'd lost their mother. She'd given up trying to get through to him. He'd nodded when she'd asked him if he wasn't speaking because he was sad about Mum. That was all she knew. Now she just accepted his silence as part of who he was, part of their fate. His silence was just one more bit of music gone from their world. Meredy continued stubbornly.
"I'm just saying, Kaitee, there are berries to fix everything. They're not magic, they're poison. People already thought you were crazy before the soldiers came. Just stop it already." "These are our traditions, child. This was our way of life for 1,000,000 moons. We lived in harmony with the land. The people, plants, and animals built this world together and protected it together. One tyrant king can never undo our history."
"He's doing a pretty good job so far, I'd say."
"If only people would listen. If only people would believe. You call me crazy, but I'm the only one who's not crazy. Nobody believes me, though. Nobody listens anymore. Our spirit has gone cold. We're dying inside. It breaks my heart."
"Eat a magic berry, then," Kaitee snipped at her. "That'll fix everything." Meredy sighed and shook her head.
"This is not you, child. This bitterness, this anger, these mocking words. This is not who you really are. Your spirit is still strong, even in adversity, like a berry bush among thorns. The gods love a strong spirit. You will do great things one day, maybe even save the world. But you must let go of this bitterness. Return to your true self."
"What does it matter who I truly am? I'm just a slave. We're all slaves." She felt tears welling up, sadness and anger mixed together, but she fought it. Meredy went slowly back to work. Kaitee took one last glance up into the sky and joined her.
"To be a whole person requires 7 things.
"Oh no, here we go," Kaitee sighed. "Another speech about the old ways." Meredy ignored her and kept talking.
"There are 7 petals on the flower of this healing berry. You see, it is for the 7 aspects of the heart: respect and humility, courage and wisdom, truth and honesty, and love. You must have all 7 in your heart to be a whole person."
The old woman plucked off one of the petals of the flower.
"You see, now this flower is no longer whole. It's missing one aspect of itself. And so are you if you are missing any of the 7 medicines of the heart."
Kaitee didn't even look. She just kept working. She would wind up doing all the work, as she always did, while the old lady would ramble on and on about petals and branches and the 7 stones around the village well. She might even get them whipped.
"Can't you talk and work at the same time?" Kaitee said. "You're gonna get us in trouble." "You're not listening, child," Meredy went on. "You need to listen. This is very important. I'm the last of our people who knows these things." Yeah, 7 petals, 7 stones, 7 feathers on an eagle's butt. I've heard all these myths and fairy tales before. None of this can save us from the guards, from the king, from slavery. You're gonna get us beaten. Again!"
Meredy hung her head sadly. She picked up her wooden fork.
"This is not you, Kaitee. So much bitterness. You are not a whole person. If you don't restore your 7 petals, you'll become an opposite person. All I am right now is a tired person. I don't care who I become in the future, as long as I'm not beaten for not working right now." "The 7 aspects all have the same opposite. That's what the old people used to say. and I never understood what it meant. But I know it's a great teaching, a great mystery."
Meredy wasn't even listening to her. She was just standing there staring off into thin air, not working.
"Why are you rambling on about it if you don't even know what it means?"
Kaitee ripped up a berry bush and shook it in her face.
"This is what matters right now, Meredy, getting the work done."
Then she threw the bush down and went at another, angrily ripping it from the ground and throwing it on the first one.
"That was unkind, child. Treat these bushes with respect."
"They're dead. They don't care." The old woman knelt down and apologized to the fallen berry bush, as she always did. She whispered a prayer, too, plucking one berry from the bush and holding it in her hand, exactly the way they were constantly told not to. Kaitee rolled her eyes and went to the next bush, sighing heavily.
"You think I'm an old fool, don't you, child? But it's you who's being foolish. You only have one soul, Kaitee. If you become an opposite person, it's a long, hard road finding your way back to your spirit and coming alive again."
"The old ways are gone. Let it go. We're slaves now, and that's all." The old woman leaned on the handle of her fork. She sighed sadly. "We don't do a lot of things we used to do, Kaitee, but we are still strong. We are still free. We still have hope in our hearts. We are still a spiritual people. We still have our own song, our own stories. We just need to find our way back. King Theron declared war on our berries and turned us all into slaves, but we are who we are in our spirits, and things will be set right in the end. Believe in it, Kaitee. It's what the song is all about." Kaitee didn't need to ask which song she meant. Her bitterness faded once again. Her angry jabbing at the earth slowed to sullen prodding. "I miss the song," she said. "It reminds me of Mum and Dad, of happier times long ago. Do you still remember the words? It's been so long I don't remember it."
"The memory is dying in me as well. Nobody remembers it anymore.
There's a strange magic in that. It's a spiritual song, and if our spirits fade, we're sure to forget spiritual things. Our whole way of life is fading away with the smoke of these berries. Children of the land something. We are children of the land," Kaitee said quietly, trying to remember, trying to revive the old feeling. "I remember the words, but not the melody."
"Nobody remembers the melody,"
Meredy told her.
"Even the old ones who've been singing the song all our lives have forgotten. The spirit of the forest is punishing us, I think. The song was sacred as the earth is sacred, but now the song has been taken from us. Punishment for destroying the forest. Perhaps we are unworthy of it. We are children of the land. Protection something," Kaitee said, struggling to remember. "We are children of the land, protected by our Father's hand," Meredy said. She spoke the words, though, with no melody or rhythm. Yes, protected. Eternal as the stars above. Guided by our mother's love," Kaitee said. "I remember now. I remember."
The older lady nodded, but she looked sad, hearing the words without their music.
"Guided by our mother's love,"
Kaitee repeated.
"Winds and water, sun and earth. Oh, what's the next line? I can't remember. Sun and earth, sun and earth. And what's the melody? How I wish I could sing the melody. It was so beautiful." "You'll remember, Kaitee," Meredy said, patting her hand. "You will help us all remember. Your soul is strong. The gods will use you to set things right. One small light from a strong soul will lead us all home."
They didn't even see the guard coming. They were facing the forest, lost in the distant memory, not working. The guard hit Meredy first, knocking her in the side of the head with his spear. She fell sideways, tipping over like a falling tree. Her head hit a rock with a loud smack, and she lay still.
"Back to work, you!"
he said, whacking Kaitee as well. She barely noticed the hit. She dove down to Meredy, horrified. "Meredy! Meredy!" The old woman wasn't moving.
"Get her up! Get her back to work, or I'll beat you both bloody!"
When Kaitee realized the old woman wasn't waking up, she panicked. She scooped up the old woman's small frame and held her, calling her name and shaking her limp figure, trying to wake her. The guard seemed as surprised as she was for a moment. He glanced to the left and to the right, as though worried he might get in trouble. Meredy was the village elder.
Then he barked at her to get up and get back to work.
She ignored him once more, too horrified to fear any beating he might give her, and then he took another swing at Kaitee with the shaft of his spear. She flinched, and it hit her shoulder, knocking her sideways, but again she barely felt it.
"You killed her! What have you done?"
The guard stood shocked once again, not sure what to do. He backed away a step. Kaitee felt herself go weak. She wanted to throw up and run away at the same time. Meredy slid off her lap and lay on the ground next to an uprooted berry bush. Her eyes were closed. She was bleeding from a wound on the side of her head. Her mouth hung open as though she would say one last thing. But she didn't say anything. She just lay there. Kaitee closed her eyes and felt something tear deep inside her. A sob escaped from the invisible wound. She hung her head, letting years of sorrow suddenly pour out of her all at once.
"No! No! Meredy!"
"What's going on over there?" a nearby guard asked.
"Nothing," the nearer guard said. "The old woman's hurt. She'll be back to work in a moment, or they'll both take lashes."
"No!" Kaitee said, still sobbing.
"She's dead! You killed her! Have you no soul?"
The second guard was approaching now. The nearer guard seemed suddenly worried.
"Have it your way, then! 20 lashes, girl!"
He grabbed Kaitee by the hair and yanked her from where she sat, dragging her toward the tree. Kaitee cried out, letting go of Meredy's hand. She grabbed the guard's fist to keep her hair from ripping out.
"You killed her!"
Kaitee said, babbling and sobbing as she was dragged along. Her legs kicked and struggled. Her scalp burned from the yanking. His grip was like iron, though.
"You killed Meredy! How could you?"
And she let out another piteous sob that made people 2 families away stop and look.
"Useless rat!" the guard said, as he hauled her up to the tree. "So she's dead! One less mouth to feed! Why are any of you still alive? Guarding you is just a waste of our time! I'm sick of it! Miserable, useless slaves! You'll never amount to anything! You'll die one day just like her and be forgotten forever!"
The guard didn't even bother tying both of her hands. In fact, he seemed more annoyed than wrathful as his superior strolled up. He hauled Kaitee right off the ground and secured one hand in a tight knot. He left her dangling like that, with her toes kicking at the empty air, her arms stretched painfully above her, her skin scraping against the bark of the tree. Kaitee closed her eyes, weeping softly. He would rip her dress from her body, exposing her back, and begin slashing away. She flinched as she waited. She whispered a prayer in her heart as she hung there.
"You cruel and unkind gods! If you won't save us, then at least destroy us all! Either way, let this misery end!"
All the world was quiet for a moment, but nobody answered her prayer. There was only the wind in the trees and the distant crackling of fires. She had one last moment to flinch, and she sobbed even harder as the guard grabbed 2 handfuls of her little gray dress. She sucked in breath, bracing for the savage tearing, but it never happened. The guard stood, unmoving.
"Meredy, why? Don't be dead, please! We can't lose you too! We can't!" "Silence, you fool!" the guard muttered. "Listen!"
His tone had changed from anger to icy dread. Kaitee listened. Somewhere in the distance, nearly drowned out by the westerly breeze, the village bell was clanging out an ominous warning. Terrified screaming erupted from every direction. The shadow was coming.